The date is November 24th, 1326. The place is the bustling marketplace of Hereford, England. The crowd is immense, a sea of nobles, clergy, merchants, and peasants all crammed together. They're here to witness a spectacle of brutal justice. At the heart of the marketplace, a wooden platform has been erected high above the crowd. Guards lead a man onto it. He's around 40, his face pale and gaunt after days of self-imposed starvation. His once sumptuous clothes are now torn and filthy. This man, once the second most powerful person in the kingdom after the king himself, is about to be executed in a manner so horrific it will be remembered for centuries. His name is Hugh Despenser the Younger, the favorite and potential lover of King Edward II of England. In a few hours, his mutilated body will become a bloody testament to what happens when you accumulate too much power and make even more powerful enemies. To understand how Hugh Despenser met this terrible end, we need to go back in time and explore the complex web of power, ambition, sexuality, and betrayal that defined England in the early 14th century. Hugh Despenser was born around 1286, the son of Hugh Despenser the Elder and Isabelle Beauchamp, the daughter of the Earl of Warwick. He was born into a noble family with significant connections, giving him a privileged start in life. His father was a loyal servant to King Edward I, the father of Edward II, and the Despenser family already had considerable wealth and influence. From an early age, Hugh was trained to follow in his father's footsteps, serving the crown and expanding his family's power. The opportunity for advancement came in 1307 when Edward II ascended to the throne. The new king was already known for his preference for male favorites. His first intimate friend, Piers Gaveston, had caused a huge scandal at court, not only by monopolizing the king's affection, but also through his arrogance and disrespect toward the traditional nobility. When Gaveston was brutally murdered by rebellious barons in 1312, a vacuum opened in the monarch's inner circle. Hugh Despenser knew exactly how to take advantage of this situation. By 1316, he had cultivated a close friendship with the king and became his chamberlain. This was a position of extreme intimacy, giving him constant access to the king. Simultaneously, Hugh solidified his position through a strategic marriage to Eleanor de Clare, the king's own niece, which brought him the rich lordship of Glamorgan in Wales. As the relationship between Hugh and Edward II deepened, the favorite's power grew exponentially. Despenser developed an insatiable appetite for lands and wealth. He used his influence over the king to manipulate the legal system and expropriate lands from other nobles and even vulnerable widows. One of his victims was his own sister-in-law, whom he forced to surrender valuable properties. When temporarily exiled from England during a baronial rebellion in 1321, he even became a pirate, attacking English merchant ships in a shocking display of his disregard for the law. When Edward II managed to regain control over the rebellious nobility, Hugh returned from exile more powerful than ever. Between 1322 and 1326, the Despensers, both father and son, weren't just part of the government. They were the government. Hugh the Younger controlled access to the king, manipulated royal finances, and exercised control over vast territories. The medieval historian Jean Froissart wrote that Despenser was King of England in everything but title. But what made the situation even more explosive were the rumors about the nature of the relationship between Hugh and the king. Even though Hugh was married and a father of several children, suspicions that he had an intimate relationship with Edward circulated at court. Chroniclers of the time suggested he was a sodomite. This term was used in the medieval period for homosexual relations, which were considered not only sinful by the church, but also an offense against the social and divine order. Queen Isabella, Edward II's wife and the daughter of the King of France, was particularly hostile toward Hugh Despenser. Humiliated by her husband's clear preference for his favorite, Isabella saw her position, her resources, and even access to her own children progressively limited by Hugh's interference. In 1324, Despenser went to the extreme of confiscating the Queen's lands and imprisoning members of her royal household. Even the royal couple's children were taken from Isabella's custody and given to Hugh's wife. The Queen's hatred finally found an outlet when she was sent to France in 1325 to negotiate a peace treaty. There, Isabella met Roger Mortimer, a powerful baron who had escaped from the Tower of London, where he had been sent for opposing the Despensers. He had fled to the continent. Mortimer became her lover and her ally in a conspiracy to overthrow Edward II and his favorite. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with a small army of mercenaries. What surprised Edward and the Despensers was the speed with which the English nobility joined the invaders. Years of abuse, extortion, and humiliation had created widespread hatred against the king's favorites. With the collapse of support, Edward II and the Despensers fled to western England, taking a considerable portion of the royal treasury with them. The escape, however, was doomed to fail. Father and son were separated. Hugh the Elder was captured in Bristol and subjected to an immediate and brutal execution. On October 27, 1326, he was hanged while still wearing his armor, then beheaded, quartered, and thrown to the dogs. It was a terrible end for a man who had served the English crown for decades. Meanwhile, Edward II and Hugh the Younger continued their desperate flight through Wales. Abandoned by almost all their followers, they were finally captured near Neath in mid-November. Edward was taken into captivity, where he would eventually be forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, the future Edward III. As for Hugh Despenser, an even more terrible fate awaited him. Knowing he had no chance of mercy, Hugh attempted to commit suicide by starving himself. His plan failed. On November 24th, he was brought to trial before a tribunal presided over by his mortal enemies, Roger Mortimer, Queen Isabella, and the Lancastrian barons who had suffered so much from his extortions. The trial was a brutal formality. Hugh was accused of an extensive list of crimes, including treason, theft, corruption, and the manipulation of the king. To avoid the appearance of pure personal vengeance, the tribunal was careful to legalize the process. However, the outcome was inevitable from the very beginning. Hugh was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to one of the most horrific executions ever recorded in English history. On the morning of November 24th, Hugh Despenser was taken to the Hereford marketplace. An immense crowd had gathered, including Mortimer, Isabella, and the victorious barons. What followed was a carefully orchestrated spectacle of public vengeance and humiliation. First, Hugh was tied to a tall ladder so that everyone could see his torment. A crown of nettles was placed on his head, a brutal parody of the royal crown that he had, in practice, shared with Edward. Biblical verses denouncing arrogance and evil were written on his skin. Then, the real torture began. According to the chronicler Jean Froissart, the executioners cut off Hugh's genitals and burned them in a fire right before his eyes. This punishment was specifically chosen to punish his supposed sodomitical practices. While he was still conscious, his abdomen was opened, and his entrails were slowly removed and also burned. Witnesses reported that Hugh emitted a dreadful and inhuman howl that echoed through the square, to the delight and joy of the spectators. Only after this prolonged torture was Hugh finally hanged. But even in death, his humiliation continued. His body was beheaded and quartered into 4 parts, which were sent for display in different cities of the kingdom. His head was placed on a stake at the London Gate, a grim reminder of the fate of those who abused royal power. The specific brutality of Hugh Despenser's execution had multiple purposes. On one hand, it served as revenge for the cruelty and greed he had shown during his time in power. On the other, it was a way to symbolically expiate the pollution that many believed he had brought to the kingdom through his influence over Edward II and his alleged sexual relationship with the monarch. The public castration, in particular, was designed to highlight and punish this sexual transgression. Just 4 years later, in December 1330, Hugh's widow, Eleanor de Clare, received permission to collect and bury his remains on the family property in Gloucestershire. However, of him, only his head, a femur bone, and a few fragments were ever recovered. It was an undignified end for someone who had once been the second most powerful man in England. Edward II's fate was no less grim. Initially kept prisoner, he was murdered in September 1327 at Berkeley Castle. The most enduring legend about his death, though contested by some modern historians, is that he was killed by a red-hot poker inserted into his rectum. This method would leave no visible marks, but would cruelly allude to his supposed sexual practices. The macabre symbolism of this death reflects the same kind of perversely poetic justice applied to Hugh Despenser. The reign of Edward II and the rise and fall of Hugh Despenser remain one of the most turbulent periods in medieval English history. For centuries, the narratives about these men were shaped by homophobia and moral condemnation of their relationship. Edward was portrayed as a weak king, dominated by his personal passions, while Hugh was demonized as an unscrupulous manipulator who exploited the monarch's vulnerability. Modern historians offer a more nuanced view. On one hand, they recognize that Hugh Despenser was indeed a greedy and ruthless politician whose rapacity alienated virtually all the English nobility. On the other, they question some of the more sensationalist accounts of his relationship with Edward II, acknowledging that accusations of sodomy were frequently used as a political weapon to delegitimize enemies. Whatever the true nature of their relationship, the fate of Hugh Despenser illustrates the dangerous intersections between power, sexuality, and politics in medieval England. His tortured and dismembered body served as a graphic warning of what happened when someone challenged social norms and accumulated powerful enemies. The story of Hugh Despenser also offers us reflections on how justice could be brutally theatricalized in medieval society. His execution was not just a legal act, but a carefully crafted public spectacle designed to communicate political and moral messages. The punishment of Despenser's body, especially his public castration, was laden with meanings about sexual transgression, political corruption, and restored social order. The fall of Hugh Despenser was as spectacular as his rise. In just a few years, he went from a relatively obscure knight to the most powerful man in the kingdom, only to end up as a quartered body displayed at the four corners of England. His story remains one of the most dramatic examples of the fluctuations of political fortune in medieval history. In a final irony, the regime that replaced Edward II and the Despensers would not last long. Queen Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer, who had presided over Hugh's brutal execution, would themselves be overthrown just 4 years later when the young Edward III effectively assumed power. Mortimer would face the same fate as Hugh, hanged as a traitor, though he was spared the additional tortures. The wheel of medieval political fortune had turned once more. Almost 700 years later, the story of Hugh Despenser continues to fascinate and disturb. In a recent survey, he was voted the greatest British villain of the 14th century, even receiving votes as one of the worst Britons of all time. His story has been dramatized in plays, historical novels, and television series, often portraying him as the archetype of the corrupt and manipulative courtier. Today, we can look at Hugh Despenser's brutal execution with horror, recognizing the extreme cruelty that marked the medieval judicial system. At the same time, his story reminds us that the dynamics of power, political favoritism, and the exploitation of privileged positions are not phenomena exclusive to the distant past. The king's favorite, who was castrated and hanged in public, offers us a distant but still relevant mirror to reflect on the complex interactions between power, sexuality, greed, and justice that continue to shape our societies.